Really interesting book, Chris.
Thank you. I'm
Weather
glad you
Permit.
like it.
Yeah. I was talking with a coworker of mine who worked uh, I guess, in the advertising or business side of the Weather Network, and she goes, "Yeah, he's written tons of books. I know who he is. He won't know who I am." But outside of writing a bunch of books, this one was really interesting because, for me at least, because you went through all these different events over the past 25 years. Weather events that obviously made the news and that we were talking about when it happened. Um, First off, I wanted to ask you. Um, you could have probably picked a dozen other different storms or weather events. Why these ones?
It's interesting because when we were laying out what we wanted to cover in the book, we decided sort of how many chapters it was going to be and how many pages, and then I had a couple of themes that I wanted to run through the book that I wanted to make sure um, were represented: climate change, the way people behave towards each other. And then I kind of wanted to be representative to different parts of the country. So there were so many things that could have gone in, and perhaps it opens the door to doing a second book and being more inclusionary to some other events. But I wanted to kind of represent um, all the various types of weather that are at play for Canadians as our climate changes.
Yeah. I want to come back to the way people treat each other. Um, I found especially the story of oh my goodness, in Alberta, the fires, Fort McMurray. I found that really fascinating. Um, as I started reading your book, the first question that came up to me was, "Is there hope?" From a sense of, we see all of these storms, and one of the things that we tend to hear more often nowadays, Chris, is another storm of the century just a few years after the last storm of the century. So in one of the chapters you talk about, instead of every 100 years of a storm, we're going to see I think it was every 3 to 7 or 7, one of those numbers. um, and understanding that climate change is happening. Are we is there hope, Chris? Do you see hope based on stuff that you know and that you've studied?
Well, yeah, and that's the hardest part about telling the climate change story is because there's two avenues. One is this apocalyptic route, and the other is with technology. There is a way to mitigate what we've done to the climate and to make the future survivable, though we are going to have to make changes. So it's two stories. Journalists have had a really hard time telling the story of climate change, and I think I do a lot of speaking engagements, and I've been telling this story prior to when I wrote the book, and it always seemed to end on this sort of dark and depressing note. And and after I wrote the book, I realized what the out was, and there's actually I just did a talk, and there's a couple of futurists who have written great stories and books. Let me just grab the name of the person. But on my glasses on, the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank, um, commissioned a study, and it was about how we get through the future. And it was always the whole story comes back to that every time humankind is put against a wall with a crisis, we find innovative ways to work our way through the crisis, and we learn. And so it's all about the learning. And Justin Bean is the futurist. He's from California, and he wrote a book called "What Could Go Right." And so I read that. I read that book just prior to Christmas this year. I wish I had read it before I finished writing this book. Um, but I think that both of our conclusions kind of lead the same way, in that we have access to knowledge, so much of it from our past experiences, and applying that knowledge. gives us innovations and ways to get around our problems, always has in our past. So there's no reason why it won't in the future. It's just, do we have um, do we have the will to make the choices we need to make? And usually we do, but it's very typical of things. We always wait to the last minute to make change, because making change is hard. And so with climate change, we are at the last minute now. Most studies say, we wanted to contain global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. Well, in the next 5 years, we're going to surpass that. So what we've done to the environment is not going to go away as soon as we make the change. Whatever changes, what we're seeing now is going to continue for the next 100 years. So for the next 3 generations, right? So it's going to. It's just, I mean, we've put the stuff up there. It's going to take time for this to come out of our atmosphere and for the Earth to heal itself. 100 years is a blink in global time. To human beings, it's a lifetime, 2 lifetimes. So it's a case of us using our innovative minds and our huge intelligence pool, because it's not one person, it's all of us thinking together to get around this problem. But it's us tapping into, accessing, and becoming much more unified as a civilization to move forward, and to know that we need to mitigate all of these things we've done, but we need to do our best to preserve so that we can continue to go forward. It's going to cost a lot. It's really interesting, because the action that's being taken on climate change now, and there is really good action being taken, not only at the government level, but through business and industry. But nobody took the action. And you look at graph lines, and the temperatures were going up, 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 up like this, and the other graph line was emissions were going up, 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 and suddenly, and I just did a talk for insurers and adjusters at a global conference, and the other thing that was happening was the cost to the problem was going up, actually higher than the temperatures. So it's like accountants have come to the rescue. They've said, well, hey, you look at this cost going out of control. We need to do something to get that in line. And the only way to get it in line is to alter our behavior.
It's to slow down, yeah.
Yeah.
Your chapter on Red River was interesting and for me in a couple of ways. One, you start off with the history of the area, of the massive lake that was present there, and then the ice age, and then what happened. How that area, why that area is the way it is. Fertile soil, but I think underneath you said clay. Is it clay?
Yeah, it's clay.
That's
Yeah,
underneath. Yeah, that stops the water from really draining
further. Yeah.
properly. And then the ingenuity of people to build defenses to help mitigate the spring flooding that happens. And I remember I literally went on my phone and go, and I'm looking, how big is this river? And it's massive. I didn't
Yeah.
realize how massive it is. So you talk about. So when I read that chapter, I go, maybe there's hope there, because people come together and they figure, stuff out.
Yeah.
But one
Yeah,
of the,
and
yeah,
that's why that chapter was in there, and in there first, because I wanted to offer hope, and a great example of how we can work solutions around problems and mitigate things in the future. I mean, I love history. History is what I was going to study in university. And I wanted to be a history teacher. Just history is fascinating, but we often don't think back 10,000 years and 20,000 years and what our planet looked like at the end of the last ice age.
yeah,
And all of those things kind of figure into where we live today.
yeah. Do you ever put on a different hat and wonder to yourself, why are we building cities in some of these areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. But it's like we didn't know then, and those were the places we traditionally built. But we, again, we get around a problem. I mean, look at the Netherlands as an example of a place. I mean, they've reclaimed 20% of that country is reclaimed seabed from the North Sea, and they built their dikes and they've built flood mitigation, and the Dutch are way ahead on climate change, and living with a changing climate, in that they have reinforced their dikes knowing that sea levels are going to rise. People there, and it's a beautiful difference between us and Europe. Canada is such a vast country and distances are so great. Europe, everything is close, so people use the train, people ride bikes to work. We live, our society is different in North America. We are heavily vehicle dependent. We choose not to live in our city centers. So I see in the future us contracting back to living in closer communities. We have
Interesting.
to. We have
Yeah.
to.
Wow. Very, very interesting. Um, I think the first time I ever heard the term El Nino, Chris, I don't know how old I was. It doesn't seem that long ago, but I'm thinking warm winds from Mexico. I think that's what was in my head. But I'm assuming it's not, or not, that doesn't tell the full story. What is El Nino, Chris?
Well, I often get them. There's El Nino and La Nina, but
Okay.
basically it is a warming and cooling of the waters in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America. So really from central Chile up to Ecuador, the waters will for there. It's a natural trend in the Pacific Ocean, an ebb and flow that takes about 7 years to complete a cycle of warm water welling to the top of the ocean or the surface of the ocean off the coast, and then colder water replacing it on a regular cycle. And when the colder water is there, it has an impact on our weather in North America. It has an impact on the fishery because more fish will be in colder water than in warmer water. So it's a cyclical thing. It's a cycle, though, that oceanographers, climatologists, and meteorologists really only figured out in the past 40 or 50 years. So what's interesting is when you think about global time, Earth time, and things being are like our life is the blink of an eye, what other cycles are there out there that have yet to be discovered yet? I mean, yeah, and which is what's neat about technology in the future is that artificial intelligence and those things will help us greatly in finding patterns that we haven't seen in so many different things. But anyway, El Nino, La Nina, they have a great impact in affecting our climate in North America. Um, the waters will off in the Pacific will impact um, the development of high pressure over the Atlantic Ocean, which um, is a key mechanism in increasing the numbers of hurricanes that come through the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast. So that's how that cycle plays uh, for us. And what we've noticed is that the cycle has wavered in the past 20 years. It's not as long as it was before, so we seem to be going in and out of El Nino, La Nina cycles a little more rapidly than we were before. And instead of it ever being every 7 to 10 years, it's reduced in its time. So therefore, the incidences of more active Atlantic hurricane seasons also increases with that.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. You must look like when you go for walks, you probably look up in the sky and you think of different things than the rest of us based on the colors you see, the clouds that you see, the time of year that it is, the temperatures. That's fascinating. Um, I was going for a walk with my dog sometime this week, and I noticed that all the shrubs were shining. And I go, oh, we had rain last night, and it froze and everything was glistening. And then I think the next day we went for a walk and everything's falling down, like little tiny icicles are falling down everywhere. And it reminded me of the chapter of the ice storm. Um, and you go to explain in your chapter, you explain, Chris, what exactly is freezing rain? What exactly is an ice storm? It's not, it isn't ice falling down, is it?
No,
Yeah,
no, it's not. And people get freezing rain confused. It's when at the Weather Now, it was one of the most common uh, questions was when ice pellets were falling from the skies, that freezing rain. No, it's not. Freezing rain, first of all, you need a complexion in the atmosphere. So think of the atmosphere like a layer cake, right? And so you've got a layer close to the surface, say a kilometer or 2 kilometers from the surface up, and the temperature there is -5 or -6 degrees, so it's cold. And then you go to the next layer, which is maybe 4 kilometers up, and warm air has ridden over the cold air. Um, Warm air will do that because it's more buoyant. The molecules are further apart. So warm air rises, like think of steam coming out of a kettle. And in cold air, the molecules are dense. They're packed together closely, so it's heavier and it sinks to the surface. Yeah, air has weight. Um, so what happens is this warm layer is like 2 or 3 degrees Celsius above freezing, and so it's rain. What's up there, moisture, is liquid. It's liquid, but as it falls into the cold air and makes its journey to the surface, it becomes super cooled, which is a really interesting term. So it becomes below freezing, but it's because there's motion involved. It's not actually becoming a snowflake or an ice crystal. It remains in a liquid state until it hits the surface, and then when it hits the surface, it instantly goes to a solid state, and the solid state is ice. So that's what freezing rain is. It's actually liquid. If you're driving your car in freezing rain, it's the best time to notice it because it appears to be raining, but when the raindrop hits your windshield, it kind of spatters, if your wipers are going, it'll streak, right, and go to like a little tiny sheet of ice with the motion of your wiper. So that's how you can tell if you're driving in freezing rain. And the temperature will always be below zero at the surface.
That
It
is
has to. It
fascinating.
has to be. So
That's
that's freezing
fascinating.
rain.
That is
It's very
freezing rain.
very misunderstood. And with that ice storm, I mean, it was catastrophic because we get freezing rain a lot in the wintertime. Like we just had it last week in Southern
Yeah.
Ontario. We're supposed to get some this coming week. We get it a lot. And what we had last week was 6 or 7 hours of freezing rain or light freezing rain. It wasn't heavy. The situation in Eastern Ontario and Quebec in 1998 was one that it just didn't stop, and it was like heavy rain. It was like raining, like rain, but freezing rain. And it started on Monday and it lasted till Friday. It just never stopped. So the accretion of ice kept building and building,
Mm,
and it was the weight of the ice that caused the structural damage. I mean, ice has weight,
yeah.
and the hydro towers couldn't take the weight. The lines couldn't take the weight. Trees couldn't take the weight. You know.
Yeah. It's just fascinating event for sure. Um, I want to end off with Red River. Um, and what really got to me. So there's a couple of things. First of all, the way you started off with your wife calling you and saying, "Hey, what's going on?"
Oh, the Fort McMurray. Yeah,
Sorry, not Red
yeah,
River. Sorry, the
yeah.
fire.
Fort McMurray.
Yeah, Fort
Yeah.
McMurray. Sorry, my apologies. Fort
Okay.
McMurray. As I'm reading, it starts off with your wife calling, "Hey, what's going on?" And I'm thinking, shouldn't Chris be telling people what's going on? So I found that a little bit comical. But then, as I'm reading it, Chris, what got to me, nothing to do with weather. You talked, earlier about the way we come together and we help and we treat each other. And I'm at fault of one of those people that when I think of Alberta, I think of a certain type of people
Hmm.
that live there.
Yep.
And I've got family there, and I've heard people talk about Alberta being a certain type of place and certain type of society, and they go, "No, families there, no." And then I'll talk to people, yeah, it is like that. But then reading your chapter, what got to me was the way that people just came together and just helped each other, whether opening their homes, opening their businesses, giving free gas, free food, and just you talk about this one guy that I think he was transporting goods, wasn't charging,
Yep.
and you might have asked him, "Is there anything you need?" And all he said was, "Can I just get a hug?"
Yeah. I mean, that's what it was like. And he was like a burly guy. Like he's the guy who was just, he was um, full of conservative morals. If he was a voter, he was a conservative vote. He's like, that's the guy he was. He was a man, he was just, and yet this went to his core. seeing people in trouble. And it was the number of people who were in trouble, and they were his friends. And I mean, they weren't his friends and neighbors. They were just people, but they're just people. And I saw that so often. I mean, I saw, you know, like we were in a guy had no gas, and he was driving like an Escalade, but he left without his wallet or anything, and it was no problem to give him money. A girl came into a place where we were doing some shots, and it was a community center all filled with diapers and just everything you would need if you had nothing. And she just needed to use a cell phone. She just wanted to call her folks in New Brunswick to say that she was okay, because she didn't have any money, no way to do that. It was, of course, take my phone and do that. And yeah, it was the outpouring of kindness and caring. And it was whatever your political stripe was, it didn't matter. Whatever you felt about anybody, it didn't matter. It was, this is a person, this is a human being, who has a family, or doesn't have a family, and needs help. And that's it's that kind of kindness. If only we could have that all the time. I mean, I think of how much better this place would be. But one of my favorite stories out of that was the Syrian refugees who had left Syria, and however they made their crossing, if it was a raft in the Mediterranean to a camp in Turkey or wherever it was, and they finally they were brought to Canada, and they lived in Calgary, and everything that they had been donated to them, and they heard about the fire, and they took everything that they had and gave it. And it was just like, because they understood what it's like to be a refugee. They understood losing everything. And so now all of those people who live in Fort McMurray, 80,000, they understand what that's like. And that's why I wrote the book, for anybody who has ever helped or been helped. That's who I dedicated the book to, because it is that the spirit of that is what we are supposed to be like, and we often forget about it in our day-to-day lives. But that's what the spirit of community and people is supposed to be, and it's within all of us to accomplish that. And it's the way you feel when you do it.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the big lessons, of the book. Yes, it's a book where we could understand more about the world that we live in, the impact of what we're doing on the weather, on the climate, the power of some of these forces, whether it's fires or storms. But it's also, who can we be as people when we decide to come together?
Yeah.
And that's, I think for me, that's what I got out of this book. Chris, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I'm glad you got that out of the book. That's exactly what I wanted you to get.
That's
so
awesome.
Great. We have great capacity. Thank you.
Absolutely. Chris has been my guest, Chris St. Clair, former host of the Weather Network, published by Simon & Schuster. The book is Weather Permitting. Just a fascinating read. If you're interested, not just in recent history, but also, how this land was formed. It's a really great read. Thank you so much again for writing it and for coming on to talk with me this morning.
Thank you.
Take care.